So I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube about color grading, and I've watched a lot of videos about other people's color grading process. And while there are a lot of talented people out there who really do know what they're doing, there's also a lot of people who sometimes are also talented, but like maybe aren't the best at explaining what color correcting and color grading even is. And having observed all of these YouTube videos, I kind of wanted to make one sort of to just kind of set the record straight. Not that everyone is getting this wrong, but I just kind of wanted to go over the basics, keep things really, really simple. We are going to be basically going over the entire color correction process and then dabbling on grading, because grading is something that I'm really not that good at, but I'll explain later. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the difference between color correcting and color grading. These terms are used interchangeably all the time, which drives me crazy because they are not the same thing. Color correcting involves doing three different things: correcting your white balance, correcting your exposure, and correcting your log footage. White balance is pretty self-explanatory. Most of us know what white balance is. Essentially, it is the temperature slider and the tint slider, and you are trying to use those sliders to make your reference for white actually be white. You're not usually just eyeballing it and making sure it looks good. You actually have a reference for white, whether it be a white piece of paper, a white card, or someone's pupil. If you're filming a person, you can use an eyedropper tool or just mask out that white area, and on your vector scope, make sure that that mask is landing right in the middle of the vector scope. In some cases, if your reference for white isn't maybe the best, you can do that, use that as like a preliminary white balance, look at your footage and be able to make the decision, actually, this might be a little bit too cool, let's warm it up, or whatever. Correcting your exposure is pretty simple. Just make sure that your highlights aren't clipped and your shadows aren't crushed. Try to find a good middle ground. There isn't really any one way to correct your exposure. I have used a gray card in the past, an 18% gray card, also known as a middle gray card, to kind of gauge my exposures in well-lit scenes. So in this scene, once I'm done filming this, I'm going to flash my gray card on the screen and mask around that gray card and essentially put that in the middle of my Luma waveform monitor. If it's at about 50%, I know my image is basically exposed. Finally, the juicy part of color correcting log footage. Now, log footage almost always has to be corrected. What is log footage? You might be asking. Not if you're using it, because you're using it, you probably know what it is already. But log footage is essentially this low contrast, washed out, very almost monotone looking picture profile. And the reason why you would want to record your videos in it is because it extends your dynamic range, essentially the amount of luminance that your sensor is recording. Recording more dynamic range basically means that you can expose for a bright sky and a dark, shadowy area at the same time. Or just depending on how much dynamic range you have in your scene, you're able to capture more luminance values and more shadow values than you otherwise would be able to, which is super helpful if you're trying not to clip your highlights or crush your shadows. The problem with working with log footage, though, is that it absolutely needs to be corrected. And I need you to listen to what I'm about to say. There's only, technically speaking, one way of correcting log footage, and most people do not do it. Most people look at the log footage, they say, oh, this is very low contrasty, let me add contrast. And so they bump up the contrast slider. And then they say, oh, this is very unsaturated, so I'm gonna bump up the saturation slider. This is absolutely not the way that you correct log footage. The only way of correcting log footage is to use the proper conversion LUT from the camera's manufacturer that you are using. If you're using a Sony camera, which I am, go to Sony.com, look up LUTs, and make sure you find a LUT for the specific log curve that you are using. With Sony's, it's also a little bit more complicated because you want to also find a LUT that matches the gamut to technically correct your log footage correctly. It's important to do this because if you don't and you just eyeball it, or you just go to your curves and you try to, reverse the log curve, you're gonna have mediocre results. The reason being is that a log curve is literally a gamma curve, gamma being exposure, and it's different for every log profile that you're using. S-log is different from C-log, C-log is different from V-log. They all are essentially accomplishing the same things, but the exact curve is a little different. And if you don't know what that curve is, it's impossible to reverse the curve to get back your saturation and contrast. So if you're shooting log footage, find one of these LUTs or just go to your camera's manufacturer and just download one from their website. They're usually free. That is the only way of correcting your log footage and making it not look ugly and gross. Getting your skin tones right is also another important part of the color correcting process. Generally speaking, if your white balance is set correctly, your skin tone is gonna look basically how it's supposed to according to the camera manufacturer that you're using. Canon skin tones are going to look a little bit different from Sony skin tones, but as long as you white balance correctly, the skin tone will usually look the way that it's supposed to look as long as you white balance correctly, which is why it's so important to do that first. You want to double check and make sure your skin tone is correct. An easy way of doing this is drawing a mask around someone's skin, whether it's their hand, their arm, their face, doesn't even matter. And drawing a mask around that, looking at your vector scope and looking at the skin tone line. You want to make sure that the skin tone or the selection that you made of the skin tone is right on that line. Now, a fun fact is that this skin tone line is a guide for what the tint of the skin tone should be, not necessarily what the temperature should be. And this is important to know because if you notice, the skin tone line goes in the direction of the warm tones and the cool tones. So making that more or less, it's still going to be on the skin tone line if the tint is correct. Temperature is still something that you have to gauge from your reference for white. You still have to use someone's eyeball or a white piece of paper or something else to gauge what the actual temperature should be at. But if you have a good reference for white, you should be able to gauge what the overall temperature and tint of your scene should be. Basically how I described when I was going over the white balance part of the color correcting process. Okay, so part 3, color grading. So this is what comes after color correcting, and it's the process of adding a creative look to your footage. I cannot teach you very much about color grading. I'm learning about it myself, and I'll definitely keep you posted on how that journey is going. But the one thing I will leave you with as far as color grading goes is you can basically do whatever the heck you want to your image. You can make the shadows really green or the sky really purple or just whatever feels right. You can get away with almost anything as long as your skin tone is accurate. Don't get this wrong. Don't make people look like Oompa Loompas. Don't make people look purple. Don't make people look green. Okay, it's probably not gonna look good. Make people look like people, okay? Just do it. So that's basically it. I hope that clears things up for you. The main things that I just wanted to kind of drive home are that in order to correct log footage, if that is indeed what you're doing, you absolutely have to use a LUT from the manufacturer to make sure that it's correct the way it's supposed to, all right? Just don't just eyeball it. You might be able to get away with it. It's really not the best way to do it. Hey guys, sorry for the interruption. I forgot to record an outro for this video right here, but thank you so much for watching, and be sure to share this video with a friend who you think might be able to use it. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.